My name is Dr. OgechiAnyanwuFinal. I'm a professor of African history at Eastern Kentucky University, Richmond in Kentucky. This presentation is entitled Deconstructing Misconceptions about Africa from Myth to Fact. The reality in most African countries today bears little resemblance to the doom and gloom hyped by the Western media about the continent, portrayed in many Western movies, and believed by many in the West. As a native Nigerian who for about 15 years studied and lectured in both Nigeria and the United States, I'm mindful of the inadequate knowledge about African societies and cultures in the Western world. Many of the students I've taught over the years in America encountered Africa largely through the one-sided negative narratives that have dominated coverage of the continent in the Western media. They easily associate Africa with words such as tribal, warlike, poverty-stricken, illiterate, disease-ridden, economically fragile, aid-dependent, and politically unstable. These words are problematic in four ways. First, they are incomplete. They fail to provide a balanced assessment of African societies in order to comprehend the totality of the African experience. Second, they tend to perceive Africa as stagnant, exaggerating only its failings while ignoring the progress the continent has made over the years. Third, they are historical. They fail to provide a historical context essential in scrutinizing the origins of problems in the continent. Worse still, they overlook the role external forces have historically played in creating the problems facing the continent today. Fourth, they downplay the role African people are playing in promoting social, economic development on the continent, without waiting for the initiatives to come from government or philanthropic organizations in the West, as the Western media often portray, and as many of my students and friends incorrectly believed. My teaching philosophy is to help my students to continually shift their worldview by providing them with access to a fundamental knowledge that can support a global view of both their own experiences and the world whose history they are learning and making. It is when they comprehend the political, economic, social transformation in Africa, especially since the 1960s, that they would fully grasp the progress the continent has made, the problems that still exist, and the promise of the future. Now let's look at politics in Africa. Many in the Western world still perceive Africa as a continent full of failed states, governed by corrupt politicians and military dictators whose policies and actions have thrown their countries into endless wars and conflict. Little, however, is known about many notable civilizations that thrived in Africa before the imposition of colonial rule in the early 1900s. Empires, kingdoms, and states such as Egypt, Ghana, Mali, Sokoto, Zimbabwe, among others, remained the pride of pre-colonial Africa and refused the assumption that Africa had no civilizations until the Europeans showed up. What many probably don't recognize is that the colonial creation of artificial boundaries largely remains at the root of many unrest and instability in many African countries today. Most countries in Africa gained their independence during the height of the ideological conflict between the USA and the USSR, otherwise known as the Cold War. No matter who writes the history of Africa, when people look back at the second half of the 20th century, they will admit that the Cold War inflicted lasting damage on Africa. During the Cold War, the USSR and the USA created or nurtured dictators in Africa who left their countries in chaos from which they have hardly recovered. U.S. Secretary of State Warren Christopher even confirmed that during the Cold War, America's policies towards Africa were often determined not by how they affected Africa, but what advantage they brought to Moscow or Washington. One of the America's closest Cold War allies in Africa was Mobutu Sese Seko. According to Transparency International, Mobutu was reported to have stolen over $5 billion from his country, ranking him as the third most corrupt leader since 1984 and the most corrupt leader in Africa during the same period. He was given audience by every American president, from John Kennedy to Bush, with the sole exception of Jimmy Carter. While in office, President Ronald Reagan hosted Mobutu as an honored dignitary at White House on 3 occasions. During one of these state visits in 1983, Reagan described him as the voice of good sense and goodwill. Indeed, Mobutu wasn't. When George H.W. Bush, Reagan's successor, came to power, Mobutu was the first African head of state to visit Bush at the White House. During their meeting, Bush called him one of our most valued friends. In fact, the harm Mobutu inflicted on his country remains a subject of endless scholarly examination. While corrupt and dictatorial African leaders should be condemned for their actions, their stories cannot be told without including the foreign governments that backed them and benefited from their misrule. Now, corruption has become a stigma attached to African people and leaders by Western politicians and pundits. It is a real problem. It has a corrosive effect on economic and political development and stability. The continent lost $1.4 trillion between 1980 and 2009 through corruption. In fact, at the World Economic Forum in Davos in 2016, Secretary of State John Kerry rightly stated that corruption is a radicalizer because it destroys faith in legitimate authority. He singled out Iraq, Syria, Libya, and Nigeria, and stressed that corruption opens a vacuum which allows predators to move in. Kerry, however, failed to acknowledge that many multinational companies aid corruption in Africa by bribing public officials, thereby sabotaging the future of African peoples. Now, little or nothing is known about Unioil, an obscure firm based in Monaco that has helped many corporations, such as Halliburton, to win contracts in many non-Western countries. In fact, an investigation conducted into the Nigeria's 1994 bribery scandal involving Halliburton in 2010 resulted in the indictment of the former U.S. Vice President, Dick Cheney, who was the CEO of the company before he was elected. It was discovered that his company gave about $182 million in bribes to Nigerian government officials in exchange for the $6 billion contract to build the Bonny Island natural liquefied gas project. This company later worked out a settlement of $35 million to avoid the prosecution of his officials. Now, the Western media pays little or no attention to exemplary African leaders such as Nelson Mandela, Nnamdi Azikiwe, and Julius Nyerere, who left a model of leadership that no one can question. The media hardly acknowledge also the anti-corruption crusade mounted by various groups and leaders in Africa, prominent among which was the one waged by the former military leader of Nigeria, General Muhammad Buhari, between 1983 and 1985, and since 2015 as the civilian leader of the country. Little is known that every country in Africa, with few exceptions, hold regular elections with thriving democratic institutions. Africa experienced a wave of democratization in the early 1990s, which resulted in a wave of transition from military or one-party dictatorship to multi-party politics and elections across the continent. Governments in these countries have recognized the crucial link between poor governance, fragility, and social unrest. As evidenced in many countries in Africa, governments and the people are taking greater responsibility for strengthening institutions of accountability and the rule of law, resolving conflicts, and overcoming fragilities, thus fostering economic stability and sustainable development and growth in Africa. Now let's look at economic development in Africa. Many in the West have come to associate Africa with hunger, poverty, and unemployment. The impression that Africa remains a lost continent persists in the minds of many in the West, despite the fact that 6 out of 13 fastest growing economies in Africa, in the world, are located in Africa. Rwanda, Tanzania, Mozambique, Cote d'Ivoire, Democratic Republic of Congo, and Ethiopia. As the World Bank reveals, these African countries possess the highest projected compound annual growth rate from 2014 through 2017. Between 2000 and 2012, Africa's exports have quadrupled from $148 billion a year to $641 billion a year. And Africa's real gross domestic product has been rising by 5% a year, more than most continents. Since 1990, 6 countries in Africa, Ghana, Angola, Malawi, Rwanda, Mali, and Niger, have reduced their global hunger index scores by 50% or more. And 19 countries have made modest progress by reducing hunger between 25 and 49%. And another 19 have reduced hunger by about 19%. Now, infrastructural development in Africa has been a key enabler for productivity and sustainable growth in the continent. African countries invested between 15 and 25% of its GDP on transport and communication between 2005 and 2012. Although the Africa's information and communication technologies market is still young, however, robust economic growth, population boom, rapid urbanization, and an emerging middle class, strong competition among providers, and the increasing affordability of mobile devices have propelled Africa to grow dramatically in recent years. Africa today is recognized as the fastest growing and second largest mobile market in the world. More than 7 in 10 Africans have a mobile phone, amounting to about 760 million mobile subscriptions, up from 15 million in 2000 across the continent. With a working population of 600 million, which is estimated to double by 2040, and with an increase in foreign direct investment, Africa's economy will no doubt continue to grow in the years to come. Now let's look at social transformation in Africa. Diseases, infant mortality, low life expectancy, poor educational quality, women's suppression are some of the words thoughtlessly used in the West by politicians and political pundits when discussing Africa. But do you know that life expectancy in Africa went from 37 years in 1950 to 60 years in 2010, with significant regional variations? For example, life expectancy is 79 years in Libya in 2009. Infant mortality on the African continent has improved by 36% over the past 20 years, from 102 deaths per 1,000 live births in 1990 to 65 per 1,000 in 2011. Maternal mortality ratio, although still high in comparison to other regions, decreased from 708 per 100,000 live births in 1990 to 415 per 100,000 live births in 2010. Now, during the colonial period, women were largely excluded from public life. Post-colonial policies created opportunities for women to emerge in positions of power in Africa. No longer are women confined to the kitchen, as many in the West still believe. Female presidents have emerged in Africa. Dr. Joyce Banda, President of Malawi. Catherine Samba Panza, Acting President of the Central African Republic. Ellen Johnson Sirleaf, President of Liberia. Aminata Toure, Prime Minister of Senegal. In fact, out of the 20 countries in the world with the highest proportion of parliamentary seats held by women in national parliament, Rwanda, an African country, is ranked number 1. Senegal, South Africa, Mozambique are ranked 6th, 8th, and 12th respectively. France, United States, Canada, and Britain did not even come close. In fact, in Rwanda, the percentage of women in parliament is 63%. Senegal, 42%. South Africa, 42%. Mozambique, 39%. Namibia, 41%. In UK, the percentage is mere 29%. France, 26%. Canada, 26%. And the United States, 19%. Now, the empowerment of women in Africa is a trend that would only continue to strengthen with positive impact on social and economic development on the continent. Now, good quality education is a solid investment with high rates of return for both economic growth and employment creation. Education in colonial Africa was elitist. Very few had access to it. Since the 1990s, Africa had made unprecedented progress in the education sector. 60 million more children in sub-Saharan Africa are enrolled in primary school, with net enrollment rising from 52% in 1990 to 77% in 2011. Net enrollment in primary school rose from 57% to 79% between 1990 and 2011 for male, and 47% to 75% for female. Gross enrollment in secondary school during the same period rose from 25% to 45% for male, and 19% to 37% for female. Gross enrollment in higher education during the same period for male was 4.0% to 9.5%, and for female from 1.9% to 5.8%. This data tells you the story of a continent with a bright future, different from the stories told by the Western media. Africa has a bright future. From 1960 to 2011, The urban share of African population rose from 19% to 39%, equivalent to about 416 million people. Although rural-urban migration poses serious challenges in terms of supply of food, housing, healthcare, and other services, but the congregation of young people in the cities has facilitated transfer of know-how, encouraged competition, and spurred improvement in productivity and in growth. One vital area for African leaders to prioritize in order to guarantee sustainable development is the agricultural sector. Agriculture is the dominant source of livelihood in Africa. It is estimated that nearly half of the continent's population is directly employed in the agriculture sector. With more than half of the world's fertile land yet unused, cropland, abundant water resources, and plentiful agricultural labor, Africa clearly has an opportunity to feed a growing population, increase productivity and competitiveness, and spur economic growth in the continent in the years to come. Thank you so much.